unit. Okay, so this unit is probably the least mathsy of all the ones we've got. It's lots of real-world consequences of IT. So the first part that we'll do today is on ethical considerations. Then there's legislative considerations. That's the legal things, what laws exist relating to computing. And then environmental issues. What impacts does computing have on the environment, and what kind of things can we do to mitigate it? So we'll start with this one here, which is the ethical one. So if you want to, we've got the stuff here. However, it's a very, very short presentation because this is almost entirely a research task, which I'll talk about in a second. So let's get this open. There we go. So ethical considerations. Right. So I can move back this way a bit now. So I have set this up. So ethics. Ethics is defined as moral principles that can govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So it's one of those things that isn't sharply defined. It's very subjective. If someone says, I don't think that's ethical behavior, and someone else says, I think it is, there is no absolute right or wrong. There's no way to say this person's right, this person's wrong, because ethics comes down to personal opinion in a lot of cases. There are some things that are very clearly heavily on one side of the ethical divide, some on the other, but there's some that are right in the middle, and it's very hard to know what's right and wrong. And what a lot of things we focus on here are those things in the middle. And one thing you need to be able to do is to argue both sides. That's not always easy. You may have a very strong opinion on one side of it or the other, but to be able to give the opinions of both sides and explain why it's not simple is a difficult thing. Now that, for me, is a really important life skill. In the last few years, the polarizing of opinions across the board on everything is monumental. And having the ability to argue for the other side, to say, well, I strongly believe X, Y, Z. However, I understand why the people on the other side of the debate think this, is a skill that many of us are losing. So this is a really important unit from that perspective. So yeah, ethical issues are rarely black and white. They're issues that both sides can be argued convincingly. Sometimes they cross over into legal stuff, but often don't. Often there's no legal precedent. It just comes down to people's perceptions of right and wrong. So the various different ethical things that are mentioned in the spec are these. Okay, so I just want you to take a couple of seconds to have a think about what you think the ethical issues might be regarding this. So privacy, piracy, waste, planned obsolescence, hacking, working conditions, energy usage, and digital divide. Remember, we're talking here about from a computer science perspective. So working conditions, we're not talking about people being forced to work in horrible conditions or anything like that. We're talking about how computing directly affects that. Obviously, people working in horrible conditions can be directly linked to computing in a couple of instances. But just for a few seconds, I want you guys to have a think about that. Normally in a class, we'd ask you to have a bit of discussion about it. We can't do that here as such. So if you've got an idea of, for any one of these, what the particular ethical considerations might be. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So for privacy, privacy itself isn't an ethical consideration. That isn't something we just say is ethical consideration. However, we can give an ethical consideration related to privacy. For example, the ethical consideration of what access should law enforcement have to our personal communication. You can give the argument on one side to say, if everything can be freely encrypted, then terrorists and people who want to cause harm can freely communicate their plans and nothing law enforcement can do to stop it, and we're going to have a huge terrorist attack. On the other hand, you say, well, if law enforcement can break encryption, then there's no way for example, journalists to expose something at the top level of government to investigate that and pass that on without law enforcement stopping them. So the people at the top become untouchable. And that's a problem as well. So that's an ethical consideration related to privacy. And there is no right answer on this. We all want to be kept safe from terrorism, but we also want there to be a way that the good guys can communicate without being eavesdropped on. Unfortunately, that can't necessarily happen, and that balance is what makes it an ethical issue. So, in terms of privacy, piracy, waste, planned obsolescence, hacking, working conditions, energy usage, and digital divide, you guys post in the chat anything you think might be an ethical consideration. I'll disappear for a second, I'll come back in 2 minutes, and I'll see what ideas we've come up with. Okay, I'm sorry, it's been out. Tough. I had that on. Right, so we've got a couple of good ideas. So, Matthew, which Matthew is that one? Is that Taladolu or Monaghan? By the way, one of the Matthews has put piracy is, do you want to take money from the workers or do you not? Well, that's one side of it. That is saying piracy is a problem because people work hard to produce that stuff and they're not going to recoup any money if piracy happens. So that's one side. It's only an ethical issue if you can argue the other side as well. So what's the argument on the other side of that makes piracy an ethical issue? There's Matthew Monaghan. Right. And then Tilly's put, if hacking's done to prevent a worse crime, is there a debate it's still a punishable offence? Well, yeah, we talked about that horrendous Stubbornville rape case where the hackers ended up with a worse crime than the rapist that they exposed. And there's clearly an issue there. In black and white, you say, well, the problem is if we start saying it's okay to hack as long as you uncover something, then people can start hacking, and then they're going to start planting stuff to cover their tracks to make sure their hacking doesn't get them in trouble. So it's never black and white. Elliot says, working conditions could be like preventing the exploitation of workers when physically manufacturing computers like sweatshops. Exactly. There's a story recently about Apple who a few years ago stated that they are going to hold themselves to a high standard, and it recently turned out that they knew 3 years ago that slave labor was being used in one of their Chinese shops, and they did nothing until it was exposed. So they are still using slave labor in appalling conditions. They're just trying really hard not to get caught, and that's a massive ethical thing. On the other side of it, well, if China says, look, we can provide it at this price, and other countries say we can provide it at twice the price, that means they have to raise the cost to what they sell to it, and we all don't want to have to pay £2,000 for each phone. So what do we do? How do we keep our access to technology where it is? How do we make sure that poor people in this country can still afford access to technology, but not exploit people in other countries? Because at the moment we are relying heavily on exploitation from other countries to enable the less fortunate in this country to access technology, and it's a nasty situation to be in. I can't remember who Pumpkin Bud was. Exploitation of privacy could be needed in order to prevent future crime. Yeah, so how do we predict what kind of crimes are going to happen in the future if we don't have the data to work on? It's not even just crime as well. There's things like we're now all used to the idea of how good Alexas are at understanding what we say. Only 5 years ago, they were appalling and really couldn't recognize what you say. You had to speak really slowly and clearly and say it multiple times. Now they almost always get it right. And that's because they've been hoovering up everything we've been saying and analyzing it. So that massive invasion of privacy to record all kinds of things we say and analyze it has led to really good voice recognition. So it's provided as a service that we all want at the cost of there being recordings of an awful lot of things we don't know have been recorded being stored permanently on Amazon servers. Planned obsolescence is from Toby. Planned obsolescence is where you purposefully make a product not last forever so the customer buys it again or pays for it to be repaired. This could be unethical as you force people to spend money. Yep, that's a very heavy thing. Technology is particularly bad for that. Phones are designed to become more useless over time, and they push out updates specifically to slow them down. They say it's to preserve the battery. Realistically, it's to make you buy a new one. Samsung was caught recently when someone took apart a washing machine and realised they'd made one of the nuts in it out of nickel. There was no good reason to make it out of nickel other than nickel corrodes much faster than all the other things, which means it corroded in the water and the thing broke just outside the warranty period. They'd chosen the metal to make sure it broke just after the warranty went. That's a really extreme example. As far as planned obsolescence goes, there's also outside technology, there's also things like the fashion industry. The fashion industry exists solely for planned obsolescence. Your clothes will last a long time. I wear clothes I bought 10 years ago, and they're still fine because as a bloke, I can wear the same shirt and tie forever and it will never be judged on it. But the fashion industry exists aimed squarely at women to say that, you know, that thing you bought 3 weeks ago, now people will judge you if you wear it. Now you need to buy this. And then 3 weeks later, people will judge you if you wear that. Now buy this. It exists purely to force obsolescence. Yeah, so we've covered privacy. We've given one side of piracy. Planned obsolescence has been covered. But again, we only got one side of planned obsolescence. What's the other side? What's the argument to say I mean, France now has laws against planned obsolescence. Most countries don't. Why not? What's the argument to say we should be allowed to have planned obsolescence? Hacking, we've said a little bit about. Working conditions, we've said a bit about. Also, in working conditions, things about automation. Think about the idea of drones that are able to do deliveries, self-driving cars. What impact could that have on people? Energy usage and digital divide. So there's a couple more things. Anything else to say about this before I cover the last of it? Toby, I like money. Okay, thanks, Toby. Right. So yeah, the planned obsolescence thing from Matthew. Thing is, if things last forever, then how does a company stay in business? If you sell something like a washing machine where innovation isn't really going much further, I mean, a washing machine now is pretty much exactly the same as a washing machine was 20 years ago. So if a washing machine I bought 20 years ago is going to last me the next 50 years, how is this company going to possibly make money? So that's, again, a trade-off. If the first generation of iPhones still work perfectly today, who would be buying new iPhones, and would Apple be innovating and producing the new technology that they do? So there's the ethical debate. Right, so I'll talk a little bit through these, and then the task is going to, well, I'll talk about the task in a second. I'll talk about one we haven't covered. So piracy, we had one side of it saying, so for example, if you just download all your movies from the internet, or if you have a Kodi box with a streaming service set up that streams things illegally, then the companies that make these things employ an awful lot of people. And if they go under because they're not getting their money back, then lots of people are going to lose their jobs. Those films aren't going to get made, and the things that you're stealing stop being produced. The PC games industry so very nearly died about 10-15 years ago. Consoles was booming, and companies just simply stopped porting things to PCs. They couldn't get games on PCs at all because piracy was such a problem. Because companies were looking at the development costs and thinking, well, we're recouping our costs on the consoles, we're barely getting a profit from PCs, because the second release on a PC, it instantly gets pirated and no one pays for it. So they stopped doing it, and you couldn't get games on PCs at all for a while. Then Steam came along and changed everything. Steam made it at a reasonable price and very easily accessible, and piracy went down because an alternative was provided. People could wait for the sales, could get a load of games cheap, and start paying for them again, and it saved the PC video games industry. So piracy has that massive problem. On the other side of it, if we think about when back in the 80s when CDs were first invented, a CD single, this is a single, not an album, it's a single song, was selling for $5.99, and that's in the 80s. That's equivalent to about £8 or £9 now. And this was things that people already had on cassette. So the industry was absolutely rinsing people for it because there was no alternative. So they charged insane amounts. Piracy came along and CD sales plummeted, and it looked like the whole music industry was going to go under. And then iTunes came along, started selling them digitally at 79p initially, and people started buying them again because 79p didn't seem too unreasonable to buy a single legally, and it saved the music industry. So in both those cases, the games industry and in the music industry, piracy led to a much better situation for customers. We now have Steam and digital distribution of games on PC, which saved the industry, and we have iTunes and Spotify and digital distribution that saved the music industry, rather than them rinsing us for £5 per single. So piracy, it can be argued, has led to much better situations. Netflix wouldn't exist without piracy. None of those things, because they would still be charging you a fortune for the Blu-ray and DVD every time. Companies will charge what they can get away with. Piracy made them realise they can't get away with that much and made a better situation for the customer. There's the ethical side of it. There's a lot of, it can be said that piracy has resulted in lots of good things for everyone. Waste. So e-waste is a massive, massive problem, and it ties into planned obsolescence. So if you're replacing your phone every year and your laptop every 2 years and your PC every few years because they've designed them not to last, what happens to all the old components? They contain quite a lot of metals that will seep out into the atmosphere and cause problems if they go into landfill. There's lots of plastics in there that don't degrade and will stay in landfill forever. So the waste that's coming from it is another ethical consideration linked to planned obsolescence. Hacking, we talked about the pros and cons of that. Working conditions, so automation. Self-driving cars look like they're going to be wonderful. Delivery by drone sounds brilliant. But every time something like that comes along, there's a human that used to do that job now doesn't have a job. Amazon's warehouses employ fewer people, and they're employed in terrible conditions, because where it used to be that warehouses would be stacked with loads of people doing lots of jobs, now there are fewer jobs to go around, so people will compete for them, will accept worse conditions. So because so much of it is done automated, the few things they need people for, they pay appalling wages for and treat them terribly. So technology replacing jobs results in more competition for the remaining jobs, which results in the ability for companies to treat people terribly, pay them less, because there's so much competition. Energy usage. So there's a recent thing a few weeks ago came out that pointed out that watching a movie in HD produces 10 times the CO2 that watching it in SD does, because of the electricity involved in transferring the extra data. If we look at things like server farms, these huge, great air-conditioned warehouses, usually in the middle of deserts, that contain thousands of servers that serve up stuff like Netflix and Google and stuff like that. They use huge amounts of energy. Now, that's obviously a problem. We know about environmental things, the whole unit on environmental issues coming up. On the other hand, those streaming services mean that we're now buying fewer DVDs with less plastic packaging. That's probably a good thing. Also, it's having access to things online means people, for example, with mobility problems that can't get to post offices easily, can now renew their driving licenses and things like that online that couldn't before. So the rise of online services has caused an awful lot of good things. It's also caused a lot of environmental damage. And then digital divide. This is the last one here. This is the idea that moving things online causes something of a gap in who can access it. A while ago, when all government services went online, it was hailed primarily as a great thing, because you didn't have to go to the post office to get hold of forms and stuff like that. So, for example, I needed to renew my passport a while back, and I just did the whole thing online, and it was sent in the post. Previously, I had to go to the post office, get a form, fill it on pen, get it checked at the post office, hand in over the stuff, get the photo taken. Now I can do the whole thing at home, much better. However, what if I don't have good internet access? What if I don't have internet access at all? What if I'm 90, have never learned to use the internet, and aren't going to? Now all of a sudden, the whole world has been cut off to me, because the physical way of doing it disappears because everyone's doing it online. That's a digital divide. The benefits that come from moving things online, there's always a small number of people that get left behind by it. And what do we do about those? I would say digital divide now is also going the other way. There's a whole generation coming through, slightly younger than you guys, who really don't get how computers work at all. As far as they're concerned now, Google is a wizard that answers their questions. They talk to their Alexas and they talk back, and they just communicate in plain text. They don't really have any kind of understanding of what's going on behind there and how keyword searches work and stuff like that. And we're going to get to a point where the sort of people who are now 20 and 30 something have a much better understanding of the internet and how that actually works than the younger generation who just grown up with it just magically answering all their questions. So digital divide is the ethical considerations that come with the idea that certain generations get left behind and certain generations have better understanding of how technology works. Okay, so if you've got any questions, post them. Otherwise, this is the task we're going to do. And I'm going to give you the rest of this lesson and the next couple of weeks to work on, the next week or so to work on it. Now, this is the kind of thing where, under normal circumstances, I'd get you to make a PowerPoint, then stand up and present it. But obviously, we can't do that now. So I'm going to ask you to make, similar to this, similar to some of your live lessons, I would hope. I hope people are making lots of videos like this rather than just giving you work. I'd like you to make something like that. So it says in pairs. It's going to have to be solo, or, I mean, you can communicate digitally in pairs if you want to help each other out. If you can find a way to do it over Zoom or something, absolutely fine. Produce a maximum 5-minute presentation on any 2 of the topics to be delivered, well, maybe next lesson, depends how this goes. Your presentation must cover an explanation of what you think the ethical concerns is and what it means, and most importantly, both sides of the ethical debate. So those are your topics. Those are available to look at. What I'm going to suggest a couple of options how you can do this. I mean, obviously, if you know how to do all this stuff with the green screen and that, by all means, have some fun doing it. Otherwise, let me just load something up. I can't have lost the mouse. Where's it gone? There we are. Otherwise, there's a really nice bit of software that I think a lot of teachers have used called Loom. Right. For Loom, it's a free service. You can sign up for it. You can get that one. And what it does, if you've got a laptop with a camera on or a tablet with a camera or something, it will capture your screen. It will make a little circle in the corner like this one here. That's that one. And you just do the stuff on your screen and you talk away, and it records both from your camera and the screen, superimpose it, and allows you to run your presentation. So if you're not sure of any other way to do it, make your presentation on it, and then once it's done and you're happy with it, use Loom to record it. Start Loom recording, run your presentation, talk through your presentation. It will record your voice, it will record that, and it will just stick it on the cloud. It doesn't give you a video at the end, it just gives you a link. You can then use that link to show the rest of the class when we want to present it. Okay, so first time we've tried something like this, trying to do you guys doing presentations during remote learning. I think if any class can handle it, it's you lot. So we'll see how well this goes. So what we need to do now is, first of all, choose your topic. I mean, I'll leave it a free choice. If it ends up we all do the same thing, then maybe we'll do something else on it later, but hopefully there'll be a bit of a spread. So choose your topic. Planned obsolescence, working conditions, e-waste, energy consumption, black hat, grey hat, white hat hacking, the digital divide, and privacy versus security. Choose one of those topics, make a presentation about it, and then record using Loom or whatever system you want to do. Record that so it's an auto-playing presentation that you've narrated or whatever. I think on Loom you can turn the camera off if you want to do it just voice. It is usually nicer to see a face, but you can turn the camera if you want to. Record a Loom or whatever about it, and then we'll have a look at those possibly next week. Or there's some weird flashing thing going across there. I think it's a car driving past outside the window and the sun reflecting off the window. But it's causing a really loud, bright flash in here. Okay. So yeah, so any questions on the stuff we've talked about or what you need to do? Well, no comments at all, so I'm assuming that's either the system's broken. Right, this PowerPoint here is under Unit 7 at the top. Will, I'm going to need a bit more detail than just confused. You're always confused. I need to know about what? Now, I've just pictured one of the 60s Batman transitions of Toby going to the PowerPoint, and then running off. So, Will, what you're not sure about? Right, so pick it, as it says down there, first of all, explain what the ethical considerations are. So there's two ways you could go with working conditions. You could go with the idea that the West's desire for technology and the constant replacement of technology and wanting the latest handset at reasonable prices means that companies like Apple and Samsung end up exploiting workers in other countries. Look at the news for stuff like that. You'll find loads of stories about sweatshops in China about how Chinese slave labor has been used to produce components that go in iPhones, because China can sell those components really cheaply because it doesn't care about people. If they use factories in the UK, those phones would cost twice as much because they'd have to actually pay the workers that produce it. Now, obviously, from an ethical perspective, you say, well, we should be paying the workers that do it. But on the other hand, do you want to pay twice as much for every piece of technology? It's a really tough call. So that's one you could talk about. The other working conditions thing you could talk about is the idea of how automation is taking people's jobs away. How more and more things that used to be done by a person are now done automatically by computers and by robots. And that means there is now more competition for jobs. People are finding it harder to get employment. And because of that, companies are having worse working conditions. So if I'm advertising for a job and I know there's only 2 or 3 people out there that could possibly do it and I desperately need them to work for me, I'm going to pay a lot. I'm going to make it as attractive as possible because I desperately need people. If on the other hand I'm advertising a job and I know there are 1,000 people out there who can do the job and they all desperately want it, I'm going to pay almost nothing because one of them will be willing to do it very cheaply. And if they don't, I say, well, this guy will do it. So the lack of jobs means people end up in worse conditions, and automation is one of the big reasons for that. So either one of those two or both are the things you could talk about for working conditions and jobs. Okay, right, so that's it then. I'll just pivot. I will keep coming back and I'll check the chat. So if something gets stuck on, post in there and I'll do that one. I'm not just going to abandon it for the rest of the lesson. Yeah, so for the next half hour or so, then we'll have a bit of a catch up and see how we're doing with it. Just be working on this stuff. Yeah, that's about it. I will do the register now and then I'll come back in half an hour or so and we'll see what kind of stuff we've managed to do so far. So I think I know